Hey guys, I'm Ted. Welcome back to our lecture series, and for this lecture, we're going to wrap up our look at the Populist Party. But before we do so, I just like to do a customary recap to discuss what we covered in our last lecture. So in the last lecture, we looked at the grievances that farmers had. We also looked at the series of unlikely coalitions that came together to form the Populist Party: European and African American sharecroppers in the redeemed states, and former United States and Confederate state veterans, comprised of sharecroppers from the European American sharecroppers in the redeemed states, and of course Midwestern grain farmers. We looked at the platform, that very forward-thinking, forward-looking, reform-minded platform that they put into place, calling for such far-reaching and really just at that point in the 1890s, radical ideas such as the direct election of U.S. senators, a graduated income tax, and of course their efforts to sort of link or combine the efforts and the strategies of all the workers in the republic, of the industrial workers and the agrarian labor force, by calling for a 8-hour workday on behalf of industrial workers. And with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our lecture. And for our lecture, I'd like to address the rationale or the background for the calling of one of their lectures. Not lecture, one of their platform points. One of their platform points was a bimetalist policy that would reintroduce silver into circulation. Now, this had its roots in the Populist Party, in the Populists themselves. They took a very hard line, a very hard stance against bankers, especially Jewish bankers. They blamed bankers for their current predicament, their current situation. They branded a series of laws passed back in 1873 as the crime of 73. And the crime of 73 revolved around legislation that removed silver as a circulating medium of currency, circulating medium of exchange as currency. Indeed, many populists would look back to 1873 as the point of origin for all of their troubles. They were mainly adherents to the old line democratic ideology of the virtuous yeoman farmer who served as the republic's guarantor of liberty. They also held many negative views about urban dwellers, about the people who lived in cities. They viewed cities as dens of vice. And anti-Semitism was also very common among the Populist Party. A lot of populist rhetoric had very strong anti-Semitic streaks. There was also a very persistent but abstract fear of immigrants among the populists. Now, in the 1892 election, they nominated James Weaver for president. Weaver was a former United States general who had served in the Civil War. He had previously been the presidential nominee for the old Greenback Party back in 1880. And Weaver's running mate, James Field, was an ex-Confederate. He was a Civil War veteran who had fought for the Confederate States. And this was an intentional move, an intentional ploy by the Populist Party, by populist leadership. This was done to appeal to veterans on both sides of the Civil War. Now, to counteract this broad appeal, the Republican and Democratic parties began to make appeals to old sympathies amongst the populist base in areas that they largely controlled. In the Midwest, where a number of United States veterans had settled after the Civil War, the Republican Party made very overt pitches that appealed to old sentiments regarding old wartime service and the memory of President Abraham Lincoln. They reminded they reminded the veterans and the settlers of these Midwestern states that they were allying with traitors and murderers. Has Lincoln had been murdered after defeating the Southern states, the Confederate states, and that the Southern states had participated all of the great troubles of the early 1860s by trying to rebel and secede from the Republic. They made a very direct and emotional appeal to that. They waved the bloody shirt. If you remember the bloody shirt from our lectures about Reconstruction, they waved the bloody shirt, and they did so they did so openly and with no moral qualms. The Democratic Party, the leaders of that party did the same thing. They echoed the myth of the lost cause to draw in sympathetic voters. They also paraded white women in front of groups of potential populist voters who called on these white or European American Southerners who were thinking of voting for the Progressive Party. They paraded these women in front of them, saying, if you don't support the Democratic Party, you're going to invite mongrellism. You won't be able to protect us, to save us from these African American lechers. You will be destroying our heritage, our society, our entire value system if you don't vote along traditional party lines. In the election of 1892, the Populist Party carried 4 states. They didn't carry any of the southern or redeemed states, but they carried 4 Midwestern states: Idaho, Nevada, Colorado, and Kansas. They will be most powerful, most strongest in Nevada and in sorry, not Nevada, in Kansas and in Colorado. Weaver also received an electoral votes from Oregon and North Dakota. North Dakota was really North Dakota had 3 electoral votes, and North Dakota really was a 3-way tie between all of the candidates. The candidates being Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, and James B. Weaver. Now Weaver sort of falls off of the national scene. He sort of falls off from being the main guy of the Populist Party. And Grover Cleveland, he won the election of 1892, but he was greeted just as soon as he had won election. He was greeted in 1893 with a severe economic depression that hit the Republic. And back then, before the 1930s, the Depression of 1893 was known as the Great Depression. It was that bad. An estimated 20% of all workers were thrown out of work by this. Employers cut wages. The Depression of 1893 would lead to severe labor riots and strikes in the year 1894, but we'll get to that a little later. Now, the Populist Party made one fact about American politics very evident. Third parties tend to lose national elections. It was very clear that had been the growing trend through all of the parties that popped up in the 1870s and 1880s. The Populist Party, great widespread appeal, couldn't really do anything in a national election. And it also exposed another thing. It also exposed the fact that national politics were susceptible to emerging social and political issues and initiatives. They also proved that third parties do not displace the 2 main parties. The lone exception to this rule, of course, would be the Republican Party, which did in fact displace the Whig Party. But even with that, it's sort of a toss-up because the Whig Party had been mortally wounded by the by sectionalism and the slavery issue, but before the Republican Party really came into being in 1854. Now, one reason for this is that one of the 2 parties always gravitate toward the platform of the third party and takes on one or more of the issues at the center, at the root of the of the third party. In the mid 1890s, the Democratic Party did this. They gravitated to and adopted the free silver or the bimetallist policy of the Populist Party, particularly in Arizona and other western states and territories that had large silver reserves, that had large silver mines. That that benefited many of the many gold and silver rushees, people who rushed into these areas to mine. In 1896, the Democratic Party was bitterly divided between gold Democrats, those who favored the current system, like and just to name one of them, the president, Grover Cleveland, the sitting president, he was a gold Democrat. He favored the current system. And you had silver Democrats, silver bugs, who wanted to adopt the bimetallic policy, and many of them had fiscal motives for it. They will benefit financially from this move from going back to silver. Now, the Civil Democrats won out at the party level and were able to nominate William Jennings Bryan, perhaps the most well-known populist figure in the Republic. So they were able to nominate him and had their presidential candidate back in 1896. And this nomination, for all intents and purposes, doomed the Populist Party, which began to wither and drew in far less voters than before. Upon his nomination, Bryan gave a speech that has become very well known, very famous in American history. This speech is known as the Cross of Gold speech, and in it, Bryan hit on the populist two most notable stances. Now he's speaking to a Democratic audience, but he is hitting on the Populist Party's stances there. He's hitting on their platform, and he uses Christian revival-like oration to conjure up this very distinct imagery about the monetary issues and policies affecting the nation. Bryan invoked this Christian imagery to convey his position on the gold standard, saying, and this comes toward the end of his speech, but it's very powerful. He said, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." This came, and I mean literally, it's. That's why the speech has the name the Cross of Gold speech. But that image right there, it really, and I'm not doing it justice, but it really hit the nerve. It really hit a nerve with the audience. It really hit a nerve with the nation, and people flocked to Bryan. Bryan became a celebrated orator in the wake of that speech. Now, the Democratic Party's adoption of William Jennings Bryan had their candidate and championing silver put the Populist Party in quite a quandary. Many wanted to support the Democrats, but many more pointed out that the Democrats had not embraced the whole platform of the Populist Party, and that the Democrats simply might not ever embrace the entire platform of the Populist Party. Now, after much wrangling and discussion, the Populists decided to nominate Bryan at their presidential candidate at their party convention. But they chose to nominate a separate running mate for Bryan. They chose Tom Watson of Georgia. So the election of 1896, presented voters with the choice of either William McKinley for the Republican Party, William Jennings Bryan for the Democratic Party, and William Jennings Bryan for the Populist Party. Interesting about this election was that votes cast for Bryan as a Democrat could not and would not be tallied with votes cast for Bryan as a populist candidate. More intriguing, however, was that even though Bryan had been given the party's nomination, he disavowed the nomination of the Populist Party, openly stating his preference to run as a Democrat. Now, this resulted in Bryan supporters. It is said that this resulted in Bryan supporters being split in votes, with some voting for him as a Democrat and some voted for him as a populist, ultimately splitting his vote and dooming him to lose to William McKinley, who won the election in 1896. Now, populism really failed because it was never able to rectify the divergent interests of the farmers who began the movement and were the chief supporters of the party's goals, especially the inflationary policy and the industrial workforce, who were dependent upon wages and low prices of goods and would have really been hurt by inflation. Now, after the election of 1896, one of the great classic novels of American history was published. This novel, of course, was The Wizard of Oz. Now, The Wizard of Oz, most people don't know this, but The Wizard of Oz serves as an allegory to the election of 1896. The book begins with Kansas. The book is set in Kansas. Dorothy lived in Kansas with her aunt M, and I can't remember the uncle's name. But it begins in Kansas, and it begins with Kansas being described as gray, bleak, and completely disheartening to live in. And it is contrasted with the land of Oz, which is vibrant and colorful and exciting and inviting. The characters are meant to represent the major figures and groups of the era. So the Tin Man actually represents the industrial worker who lacks a heart, because the industrial worker did not or would not sympathize with the plight of the farmers. The Scarecrow represents the farmers themselves, the farmers who have no brain and cannot do what is right for them. They cannot act collectively to do what is right for them. The Lion is William Jennings Bryan. Bryan, who had a lot of rhetoric, very fiery speech, but no real bravery. And this was a jab at Bryan not wanting to run on the the Populist Party ticket, preferring to run as a Democrat because the Democrats were a long-established party and the Populists were not. So the Cowardly Lion is a reference and a jab to William Jennings Bryan. And of course, the Wizard of Oz, who is all-powerful and almighty, but really lacks both might and authority, is none other than the winner of the election of 1896, William McKinley. So the Wizard of Oz is a very interesting critique of the election of 1896, and one that I think a lot of people aren't generally aware of. So eventually, the populists and a number of populist laws a number of the aims of the populists, a number of their platform, their speaking points, a number of them eventually found their way onto state and federal law books. Federal income tax and the direct election of federal senators were accomplished in the 20th century by the 16th and 17th federal constitutional amendments. These were direct speaking point. They are directly lifted from that 1892 party platform written by Ignatius Donnelly, that reform and revolutionary, the very reform-minded revolutionary instrument written by the populists upon their party creation. Those who found their way in the federal law books. The Hepburn Act of 1906 brought closure to the populist aim of stricter and closer regulation of the railroads, and this greatly strengthened the powers of the Commerce Commission. The Hepburn Act did. Many of the farmers' initiatives fell apart, though, or were simply besieged upon by the inherent problems of their predicament well into the 20th century. Bankruptcy rates remained very high, and bankruptcy were very common for farmers after the movement fell apart. Many lost their land. Many were forced to become tenant farmers. Racism as well. Racism played a very major role in the affairs of Southern farming politics, as sharecroppers continued to see minimal returns. And Tom Watson, who had earlier been such a passionate and well-known advocate for an integrated approach to solve the inequalities confronting Southern farmers, he became racist. He became one of the most outspoken, if not the most outspoken racist in Georgia political history. During his tenure as a senator, he maintained what can only be described as a militant position on Jim Crow racial segregation. So the farming population, a number of their initiatives made it onto the law books, but they as a whole didn't really improve. Their lot as a whole didn't really improve that much, and many of their most well-known leaders jumped ship or simply refused to be associated with them. And has the farming population continued to shrink, has it shrank more and more, had people moved into the cities in search of better wages and more excitement and more opportunities in the 20th century, the farmers largely lost their status as a major voting bloc nationally and became what they are today, a special interest or fringe group. And with that said, we'll end our lecture here. I want to thank you guys for listening to the lecture on the Populist. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture, and I will see you guys next time for another Fast Fact.